In 1982, the cult classic Blade Runner was released. While it was initially both a flop at the box office and it received mixed reviews, over the past few decades, it's come to be recognized as one of the most influential science fiction movies ever made. There are also many different versions of the original Blade Runner, and each time a new version was released, it was clear that there was still plenty of interest in this universe. So naturally, as soon as it was possible, a Blade Runner sequel was put into production. This sequel would eventually come to be known as Blade Runner 2049. Released in 2017, 35 years after the original, Blade Runner 2049 followed in the footsteps of its predecessor, as in it was also a box office bomb on release. Yet again, like its predecessor, it is widely considered to be a near instant classic science fiction movie, and one of the best films of the 2010s. Blade Runner 2049 tells a poignant narrative focusing on the meaning of both reality and humanity. It features one of the most enthralling worlds in all of cinema, captured through the lens of an all-time great cinematographer-director duo. If this movie is so great though, why did it fail? And what makes it such a special film in the first place? Today we'll be finding the answers to those questions as we take a deep dive into one of my personal favorite films, Blade Runner 2049. Ideas for a Blade Runner sequel had been thrown around since the 90s. There was just one problem that stopped any of these ideas from actually being put into production. The original Blade Runner was based on Philip K. Dick's novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Because of licensing disputes over the novel, it wasn't possible to actually get any Blade Runner sequel ideas off the ground. That all changed in 2011, however, when Alcon Entertainment co-founders Andrew Kosov and Broderick Johnson bought the IP from Bud Yorkin, who was an executive producer on the first movie. And almost immediately, Kosov and Johnson got to work on getting a Blade Runner sequel into production. By late 2011, Ridley Scott was attached as director, with Hampton Fancher and Michael Green attached to write the screenplay. Notably, Hampton Fancher also co-wrote the original Blade Runner as well. Soon after Ridley Scott's attachment to the project was announced though, he'd step down as director in order to focus on Alien Covenant. Scott would stay on as an executive producer though, and he allegedly also made significant contributions to the screenplay. Now in desperate need of a talented director, Kosov and Johnson turned to Denis Villeneuve, who they had worked with once previously on his 2013 film, Prisoners. Since he was a huge fan of the original Blade Runner, Villeneuve was apprehensive about directing the sequel, as he didn't want to tarnish its legacy. He did like the screenplay though, so he eventually agreed to direct it. With a talented director, proven writers, and a studio that had full faith in the crew they'd put together, the Blade Runner sequel officially entered production. The lead role of K allegedly had been written with Gosling in mind, and fortunately, he was quickly convinced to join the project. Other notable casting choices include Ana de Armas, Carla Yuri, Dave Bautista, Jared Leto, and the returning Harrison Ford. Now, Harrison Ford playing the role of the tired, sarcastic old man who's kind of over it all isn't anything new, but the fact that he appears in the movie at all is interesting. As for Jared Leto, this is by far the best performance I've seen from him. His cadence and grandiose manner of speaking gave him this almost divine, menacing presence. Dave Bautista doesn't get much time to shine here, but his performance is flawless in what little time he does have. Likewise, Carla Yuri only has a couple scenes, but her performance stands out for a pretty simple reason. She behaves differently from every other character in this series. Almost every other character in both the original Blade Runner and its sequel is quite stoic and reserved. Carla Yuri's character, Dr. Anna Stelline, is the exact opposite though. She smiles, she cries, and she doesn't hinder Kay in his investigation. She has this endearing quality about her that makes her stand out against everyone else, which does prove to be an important detail later in the narrative. And finally, we have to talk about Ana de Armas' performance as Joy. While at first glance her performance may not seem to be all that impressive, for reasons we'll get into later, Joy is actually one of the most nuanced and complex characters in this story, and Ana de Armas did a fantastic job of portraying that. One of the best parts of Blade Runner 2049 though are the visuals. Both the production design and cinematography are some of the best I've ever seen. From a production design perspective, 2049 takes many cues from the original Blade Runner, but makes just enough changes to give 2049 a unique look, which makes sense in universe, as 30 years have passed since the events of the first film. Denis Villeneuve is also a director who prefers to do as much in-camera as possible, which motivated his decision to use miniatures instead of CGI in many cases when crafting this world, and you can't argue with the result. As for the cinematography, there's a reason this film managed to win the Academy Award for Best Cinematography over some tough competition that year. Many of the greatest shots I've ever seen belong to Blade Runner 2049. In fact, one of my favorites is just 4 minutes into the movie. Cinematographer Roger Deakins truly did a phenomenal job here, and in the end, shot one of the most visually impressive pictures ever made. It's also worth mentioning the music in 2049. While the music here doesn't play as big of a role as it did in the original film, What music we do have is outstanding. Composed by Hans Zimmer and Benjamin Wallfisch, the soundtrack in 2049 deliberately reflects the sound of the original Blade Runner, and naturally, it fits perfectly here as well. I will say though, that if I had to choose, the original Blade Runner soundtrack is still superior in my opinion. Although that's not exactly fair, as the music was more of a focus in that story, it being an essential part of the world Ridley Scott was trying to convey. Expectations for Blade Runner 2049 before release, from both a critical and commercial perspective, were high. Once the movie finally came out though, the box office performance was disappointing to say the least. It did well with critics, and the word of mouth was decent as well, but the numbers just weren't there. One possible explanation for this is its runtime. One complaint most critics were in agreement on was the fact that the film was just too long. At over 2 hours and 40 minutes, Blade Runner 2049 is not only long, but also paced quite slowly. While I don't think this takes away from the movie at all, I am a bit biased in that regard. Generally, I actually do prefer longer films. Not every story warrants such a runtime, but I feel it's earned in this case. Unfortunately, a near 3-hour movie is not only a tough sell to a general audience, but it also doesn't permit as many showings as most other blockbusters. I think the compounded effect of fewer showings, combined with the fact that the cyberpunk genre is relatively niche to begin with, and that this is a sequel to a film that was 35 years old at the time, was a recipe for disaster. And considering everything going against Blade Runner 2049, I think it actually did much better than should have been expected. But that can only really be seen with the benefit of hindsight. Another reason Blade Runner 2049 failed to break even though, was because of its marketing cost. It actually made back its budget and then some, but the absurd cost of marketing is where it loses money. This is actually fairly common for blockbusters, but Blade Runner 2049's marketing is notable for another reason as well. Prior to release, 3 short films were made to fill in the 30-year gap between the original movie and this story. Each depicts a major event significant to 2049's narrative. First was the animated Blade Runner 2022, Blackout, directed by the legendary Shinichiro Watanabe. Now, one of my favorite series is Cowboy Bebop, of which Watanabe was greatly involved with. And interestingly, the original Blade Runner was a major inspiration for that anime series. So this was sort of a full circle moment for Watanabe. And of the 3 short films, Blackout is by far my favorite. The animation is phenomenal, and the story it tells is interesting as well. The Blackout is an event that's mentioned several times in 2049, and this short film depicts exactly what went into that attack. After the Nexus 6 replicants all died out due to their shortened lifespans, the Tyrell Corporation released the Nexus 8 with open-ended lifespans. This sparked the human supremacy movement, which led to riots and violence against replicants, which were being identified through the replicant database. The Blackout was a coordinated attack by a rogue group of Nexus 8 replicants that destroyed all digital records, which would leave humans with no way to identify replicants, other than the serial number under their right eye, which some chose to remove. Because of this event, production of replicants was banned in 2022. I loved this short. It has that same stylized flair that Watanabe is known for, and at just about 15 minutes, Blackout is given enough room to breathe and tell its own story. The next short, Blade Runner 2036, Nexus Dawn, is a live-action short film starring Jared Leto as Neander Wallace, and it was directed by Luke Scott, Ridley Scott's son. Blackout ended with text claiming that over a decade after the Blackout, the Wallace Corporation was allowed to resume production of replicants. Nexus Dawn depicts the events that led to that decision. This short is only 6 minutes, but it just depicts one particular conversation, so the runtime works for what it's trying to accomplish. In this conversation, Neander Wallace proves his replicant's unflinching obedience by ordering his angel, as he calls him, to end his own life, to which the replicant obeys without hesitation. While the scene ends there, it can be assumed that this is what motivated the repeal of the ban on replicant production. As is the case with 2049 itself, Jared Leto's performance is great. While this short isn't anything too special, it serves as a decent introduction to Neander Wallace, and in seeing just how obedient Wallace's replicants are made to be, it adds weight to the events of 2049. The third and final short film is Blade Runner 2048, Nowhere to Run. It's yet another live-action short directed by Luke Scott. It stars Dave Bautista as Sapper Morton, a replicant trying to blend in post-Blackout. After a mother and daughter are attacked, he defends them. However, he reveals himself as a replicant and kills one of the assailants. The short ends with him being reported to the Blade Runners. I actually really liked this one. Sapper Morton was one of the more interesting characters in 2049, in large part due to Dave Bautista's performance, so it's great being able to see more of him. Also, the action sequence is well done and wouldn't feel out of place within 2049 itself. Overall, I feel that all the shorts are worthwhile additions to the Blade Runner franchise, and they each provide a bit of context that only improves Blade Runner 2049. A major reason the original Blade Runner is held in such high regard is because of its visuals. It was not only significantly ahead of its time, but it even holds up today. At no point during that film am I reminded, from a visual standpoint, that it released in the 80s, and I hold 2049's visuals in similarly high regard. I've already mentioned just how incredible the production design and cinematography are in 2049, but I can't overstate just how essential that is in a film like this. If the world of Blade Runner 2049 was too abstract, it could distract from the relatively grounded narrative. Yet if its world is too grounded, you lose what I consider to be the main draw of the series, and 2049 struck that balance beautifully. The setting of Los Angeles 2049 is less vibrant than the original Blade Runner's was, but I think this works for this story. The original Blade Runner was definitely dark, but it also had its campy moments. 2049 tones that down, so that this world, while still captivating, has a more bleak, unsettling atmosphere. There's a lot more gray and less bright lights, and unlike the theatrical version of Blade Runner, things don't improve when we leave the city. In fact, they get worse. The entire world of 2049 has this pervasive hopelessness that reflects the narrative well. And speaking of that narrative, it's about time we get into that. The biggest surprise to me on my initial viewing was the simple fact that our protagonist is a replicant. KD6-3.7 is a replicant serving as a Blade Runner, and through this, we see just how much things have changed since the original story. Even the role of Blade Runners, which seemed like a job only a human is capable of doing, have been replaced by a replicant. These newer models' unflinching obedience allows them to even murder their own kind without batting an eye. Not only that, but we later see that the public perception of replicants has only gotten worse since the events of the first movie, and the short films paint a pretty good picture of why this has been the case. Still, these new replicants obey without a second thought. What makes this an especially harrowing idea is the fact that these aren't just mindless slaves either. They have wants and desires of their own. These are just superseded by whatever command they're given. We're shown this fact when Kay returns home after retiring Sapper Morton. He clearly doesn't enjoy what he does for work, as he tells Sapper that he prefers to keep an empty stomach until the hard part of the day is done. He also likely doesn't appreciate being treated as subhuman by all those around him. But in a sense, it's all worth it when he returns to the little piece of paradise he's created back home, wherein he roleplays a traditional working husband-housewife relationship with his AI girlfriend, Joy. And this was one of the most fascinating aspects of the story to me. While initially this whole dynamic is uncomfortable to say the least, there are some beautiful moments here. On a first viewing, scenes like Joy and Kay standing in the rain, and much later in the story, Joy and Kay's love scene, come off as genuinely romantic. Once you start to peer a bit deeper into it though, the facade begins to fade away. And the best example of this is the aforementioned love scene. When the scene began, I figured it would be nothing more than a reference to one of the worst scenes from the original movie. But in practice, it's so much more. The visuals are fantastic, the music is ethereal, and there are so many great small details, like how Mariette keeps her eyes open while kissing Kay. This moment is so visceral that we may fool ourselves into seeing some genuine beauty in this relationship. But suddenly, the scene ends as we cut to a sobering reminder for the audience. Joy is an AI programmed to do and say whatever Kay wants. As the tagline says, everything he wants to see and everything he wants to hear. That's all this moment is, and nothing more. And with this idea in mind, every interaction between the pair is recontextualized as Joy's real motivations are now clear. She is an extraordinarily advanced AI who knows what Kay wants even before he does. While Kay initially rejects ideas like how he may be the abandoned child he's searching for, or having a real name like Joe, he eventually gives in. As much as he denies it, Kay wants to be special. He wants to be loved and wanted. So Joy, being aware of this, loves him. And this is where I've seen various alternate interpretations of Joy's character. Many disagree and believe that Joy at some point in this narrative goes beyond her programming and genuinely loves Kay. Yet I would disagree with that notion. Since she never acts in a way that is in opposition to Kay's interest, I wouldn't say she ever goes beyond her programming. Her intense love for Kay that can seem at first to be genuine is just what Kay wants, so it's what he gets. Kay wants someone to genuinely love him, so that's what Joy appears to do. And I want to make it clear that I don't think Joy is conscious of her manipulation. She's only following her programming. Even when she puts herself at risk to beg for Kay's life, I believe she only does that because that's what Kay would want her to do. Not that he'd want her to put herself in danger per se, but he wants someone to love him so much that they'd be willing to do so. Another interesting detail about this scene is Love's callback to something she said earlier in the story. When Love and Kay first meet and she discovers Kay owns an emanator, she asks if he's satisfied with their product. Just before she crushes the emanator though, effectively killing Joy, she says, "I do hope you're satisfied with our product," while staring at Joy. While this could of course simply be understood as her speaking to Kay, referring to the emanator, seeing as she's staring at Joy, she could also be speaking to Joy, referring to Kay, as he's also a product of the Wallace Corporation. The significance of Joy and Kay's relationship doesn't end with her death though. In fact, one of the most significant scenes not only for that plotline, but of the entire film, takes place soon after. After being brought down to his lowest point, Kay is confronted by an ad for Joy, in which the ad uses many of the same phrases said by Joy throughout the narrative, all but confirming that Joy never exceeded the bounds of her programming, with the nail in the coffin being the ad referring to Kay as Joe, the supposedly special name Joy gave to him earlier. In order to understand why this scene is so effective though, we need to talk about what happens just before. Throughout this entire story, Kay has been searching for a child born of a replicant. What should have been impossible is alleged to have occurred, which, if news of this were to ever get out, it would tear apart the very foundations of this world. Those foundations being the core belief that replicants are inferior beings, which is meant to justify their use as slaves. If they are capable of conceiving a child, however, that would then be enough to make them special. It would give the replicants the heart to rise up against the oppression they've been subjected to for far too long. Kay is tasked with finding and retiring this child. During his investigation, however, he discovers that he himself is the child he's searching for. He denies this for as long as possible, until it is absolutely certain in his eyes that this is the case. Which, if this truth were to ever come out, it would mean that he would be hunted by another Blade Runner for the rest of his life. So in order to preserve his own life, he lies to his superior, claiming that he already retired the child. This is perhaps the single most significant moment in the film, and yet many don't realize just how important it is. For a moment, let's go back to the second short film released prior to 2049, Blade Runner 2036, Nexus Dawn. In that short, we saw that, if commanded, these new replicants would end their life without hesitation. Yet here, Kay is capable of lying in order to preserve his life. From where does this newfound disobedience stem? It's not simply that Kay really doesn't want to die, but rather in believing himself to be the chosen one, as it were, the only replicant born of a woman. He gains the audacity to unlock his autonomy. He believes himself to be more, so he becomes more. He continues his investigation in an attempt to uncover what he believes to be his past. However, after being mortally wounded, and with his alleged father having been taken, Kay is rescued by a rogue group of replicants led by a replicant named Freyza. As she speaks on the meaning of this child for replicants, and how this child will eventually serve as a messianic figure for their uprising, a crowd of replicants surround her. In this moment, both Kay and the audience believe him to be the aforementioned child. It seems clear that this third act is building to some all-out war led by the one-of-a-kind savior of the replicants, our protagonist, KD6-3.7, or as he's now called, Joe. And as cool as that would have been to see, this isn't that kind of movie. It's revealed that Deckard and Rachel actually had a daughter, none other than Dr. Anna Stelline, who Kay saw earlier for confirmation of whether his memories were real. I mentioned earlier how she stood out against every other character in this story, and on my initial viewing, I figured she would return in some capacity due to this fact, but I never imagined she would play this important of a role in the narrative. This was such a great twist. While I sort of figured that Kay wasn't the child, I never would have guessed that we'd already met the one he was looking for earlier in the story. Naturally, this news completely breaks Kay though. This thought that he was somehow special, different from all those around him, it's motivated him throughout the last hour of the narrative. It's what gave him the confidence to disobey direct orders. To suddenly have that all ripped away at such a critical moment is devastating. And to top it all off, Freyza then gives him a job. Kay must kill Deckard so that he doesn't give any information about her. And while he did kill for a living before, we've already seen that Kay's hesitant to kill anything that was born. And just to recap where Kay is at in this moment, after having failed his baseline, he can't go back to work as a Blade Runner. He isn't special in any particular way, just an ordinary new-gen replicant. And his only path forward seems to be to go back to killing at the orders of someone else. This is the state we find Kay in as he's confronted by the Joy advertisement. And this can be described as nothing short of rock bottom. Everything he's ever known has been ripped away from him, and the thoughts he had begun to replace that previous life with have been ripped away from him as well. And now with the revelation that even his relationship with Joy wasn't real, he has nothing left. His identity and reality are now gone, and all he's left with is a choice. Does he go back to simply following orders, or not? With everything he used to justify his autonomy now being gone, it would seem that it really isn't much of a choice after all. But this brilliant final act provides us with an interesting answer to that question. First off, this final act is incredibly impressive just from a technical standpoint. The action is well choreographed, the cinematography is top-notch as always, the music is phenomenal, and the stakes feel incredibly high. Just before the sequence begins, the last thing we see is Kay holding the gun given to him to kill Deckard with, clearly contemplating what to do. So when we see him begin to shoot down the craft transporting Deckard, we don't know what choice he's made. As soon as he approaches the vehicle though, it's fairly clear that he doesn't intend to kill Deckard, as he's given the chance to, but instead simply looks at him. From this, we discover that Kay has made his own choice, independent of what he's been ordered to do. Before we get to how he's done this though, there's one other interesting aspect of this sequence that warrants discussion. Love, Wallace's replicant assistant / enforcer, also displays a degree of autonomy. Throughout a majority of this narrative, Kay and Love have acted as a foil for one another for this reason. But what is it that gives Love the audacity to make her own decisions? Well, she actually says why in this scene. After believing she has defeated Kay, she claims that she's the best one, quoting Wallace, who earlier mentioned how she was the best angel of all, a term Wallace routinely uses to refer to his replicants. In believing herself to be the greatest of all the replicants, she's unlocked the ability to lie and make her own judgment calls. With that being the case for her, what is it that now motivates Kay to make his own decisions? Well, that's the interesting part. He doesn't have to justify his autonomy to himself anymore. Instead of his motivation being a belief that he is worthy of his independence, he's motivated by the desire to do the right thing. As Freyza mentioned, dying for the right cause is the most human thing they can do, and he's made his own decision on what the right cause is. Why is it that Kay believes saving Deckard is the right thing to do though? Well, as I mentioned earlier, Joy does nothing more than reflect Kay's desires. She does and says everything he wants to see and hear. And as we saw, she loves him more than anything else and is willing to put herself in harm's way for his sake. Kay wanted someone to feel that way about him. So the idea that motivated Kay to save Deckard is simple. It was empathy. He put himself in Deckard's shoes and thought about what he would want someone to do for him were he in Deckard's position. And he would want someone to love him enough to put their life on the line for his sake. Empathy is the driving force that inspires him to save Deckard. Keep in mind though, this whole process for Kay began from a misunderstanding. All it took to break free from his chains was to believe that he was worthy of breaking them in the first place, which in effect also presents a flaw in Freyza and her rebellion's thinking. While presenting the child to the world would no doubt inspire the necessary confidence in replicants to also break free from their own chains, she isn't actually necessary. Each replicant already has the power to do so, simply by believing that they are worthy of their own autonomy, regardless of the worth assigned to them by their society. It's a powerful message that not only has in-universe application, but is also relevant to the real world. Unfortunately, doing the right thing doesn't come without its risks though, as Kay is mortally wounded in his righteous quest. And this final scene is one of the most emotionally resonant in any film I've ever watched. As Kay bleeds out alone, a reprise of the Tears in Rain theme from the original Blade Runner begins to play, calling to mind that incredible moment and creating a parallel between Roy's sacrifice and Kay's, both of which, in their final moments, decided to show empathy and sacrifice themselves for the sake of another, truly proving to be as advertised, more human than human. I've long felt that Roy was secretly the protagonist of the original Blade Runner, so to actually see a similar story from the perspective of the replicant was fascinating, and many critics felt the same way. Much like the original Blade Runner, since its release, the public perception of 2049 has only become more and more positive. It strikes this brilliant balance between doing its own thing, yet still making callbacks and utilizing what worked from the original film. It also manages to use some of those legacy elements without stepping on the toes of the original. For example, we never get a solid answer as to whether Deckard is a replicant or not in 2049. That question is still left open to debate. And while 2049 seems to most likely be continuing off from the final cut of the original Blade Runner, there technically isn't anything here that makes any of the other cuts irrelevant. It could very easily be seen as a sequel to the theatrical cut as well. Blade Runner 2049 is a legacy sequel done right, and it's very clear that everyone involved in this production had a great respect for the classic that started it all. And of course, with Denis Villeneuve serving as director, and considering that he was a huge fan of that original film, a lot of the credit for 2049's success rightfully goes to him. In fact, for just over a decade now, He's proven to be one of the most talented and reliable directors in Hollywood. With that being the case, and with his latest picture, Dune Part 3 on the horizon, I figured now would be as good a time as any to take a look at his career up to this point. So, for the next few months, I'll be doing a retrospective series on the career of Denis Villeneuve. If that sounds interesting to you, subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching.